Oh boy, are we heading to another S storm here? Well, the British government wants to remove environmental regulations from the time of EU membership and thus boost the construction of new houses. By relaxing what they call disproportionate and misaligned old EU rules on water pollution, up to 100,000 new homes could be built by 2030, as Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said on Tuesday. In addition, billions would flow into the economy and tens of thousands of jobs would be supported. Environmentalists were appalled. The thing came from Michael Gove, by the way. The head of the organization Wildlife Trust, Craig Bennett, spoke of disgusting behavior. The change will result in a lot more feces in our rivers, but will not solve the root causes of the housing shortage. Bennett said this in a statement, and the environmental umbrella organization Wildlife and Countryside spoke of the heaviest blow to environmental laws in decades. The fact that millions of liters of untreated sewage flows into rivers, lakes, and the sea every year has long been a source of criticism. The water suppliers want to significantly increase the fees because of the necessary renovation. Consumer advocates are outraged about this as well. Currently, new built in dozens of English communities were protected areas, and they must be nutrient neutral or something like this. And for this, builders must prove that they do not allow any environmentally harmful phosphates and nitrates to get into nearby bodies of waters. And newly built areas are considered a risk because sewage from houses and construction sites can damage wildlife and lead to excessive algae growth. The government rejected the criticism. Water pollution from new build is very low and will be offset by an investment of £280 million, as they say. Sunak stressed that he was committed to protecting the environment, but this would be done in a proportionate and pragmatic way. The pollution of UK coasts and rivers by sewage discharged feces is a serious problem. Although the sewage treatment plants in Great Britain have been greatly modernized in recent decades, billions of liters of wastewater still end up in the environment every year. In addition to feces, this also contains other pollutants such as chemicals, hormones, and microplastics. The consequences of sewage sludge wastewater pollution are manifold. They can lead to a deterioration in water quality, adversely affect aquatic life, and pose a health hazard to humans. A 2020 University of Exeter study showed that sewage sludge effluent pollution in the UK is affecting water quality in many rivers and coastal waters. The study found that the concentration of fecal matter in many bodies of water is higher than the allowable limits. This can lead to a deterioration in the living conditions for aquatic life as they become poisoned with the feces. Sewage sludge pollution can also pose a health risk to humans. Studies have shown that feces can contain certain pathogens that can lead to illnesses such as diarrhea, vomiting, and typhoid. More effort is needed to reduce the burden of sewage sludge effluent on UK coasts and rivers indeed, and this includes the modernization of sewage treatment plants, the introduction of new technologies for wastewater treatment, and the reduction of the amount of wastewater released into the environment. In 2021, the UK government announced that by 2030 it aims to improve wastewater treatment in the UK. To this end, the government would invest £6.5 billion in modernising the sewage works. The UK government's action would be an important step towards improving water quality in the UK. However, if the government implements these new plans now, it will cause exactly the opposite. Fecal pollution of Britain's coasts and rivers can have a number of negative consequences, as I said, and this includes the pollution of the water, the damage to marine life, the health hazard of humans, and feces can increase the concentration of nutrients in the water. This can lead to algal blooms that make the water cloudy and foul-smelling. Algal blooms can also encourage the growth of toxic algae that can be harmful to human and animal health. And as I said, feces can also contain pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites. These can infect humans and animals when bathing or swimming in polluted water. And possible consequences of infection include diarrhea, stomach cramps, vomiting, and even respiratory infections. To reduce fecal pollution on Britain's coasts and rivers, it is really important to continue to modernize wastewater treatment plants and to enforce the legislation more strictly. Water quality in UK waters even prevented UK seafood exports to the EU. The EU has strict water quality regulations in areas from which seafood is exported. These regulations are designed to ensure that the seafood is safe for consumption and free of pathogens. And the EU has found that water quality in some UK coastal areas does not meet EU rules. This mainly affects the coastal areas in the northeast and west of England and some rivers in the south of England. As a result of these findings, the EU has restricted seafood exports from these areas to the EU. These restrictions affected the sale of seafood from the UK to the EU. And the EU has introduced restrictions on seafood exports from those UK coastal areas where water quality does not meet the EU regulations. There was an export ban on certain types of seafood. The EU has introduced this export ban for certain areas on some types of seafood that are particularly susceptible to pathogens. These include in particular mussels, oysters, and shellfish. And there are catch restrictions. In some areas, the EU has restricted seafood catches, and this is done to reduce the pathogen load in the water. And there are stricter checks. The EU is conducting increased checks on seafood from those areas. This is to ensure the seafood is safe for consumption. And these restrictions, of course, vary by the area, but the EU has published a list of affected areas and the restrictions in place. And the EU restrictions have affected UK seafood exports to the EU in 2022. For example, the exports fell by 15%. And this was partly due to the restrictions, but also factors such as inflation and Brexit also played a role. In certain cases, British companies are indeed allowed to discharge untreated sewage into rivers. This is permitted by law if the sewage treatment plant is overloaded, for example, in heavy rainfall. In this case, the wastewater is discharged into overflow pipes that flow directly into the rivers or the sea. Overflow pipes are an important part of the sewage infrastructure in the UK. They prevent sewage treatment plants from overflowing during these heavy rainfalls and the sewage from flowing into the streets and houses. And now it flows into the rivers. The use of overflow pipes is regulated by law, and the regulations are set out in the wastewater legislation. The regulations for the use of those overflows stipulate that companies must report the use of them. This is intended to help reduce water pollution. The regulations also state that the amount of raw sewage going into overflow pipes must be documented, and this is to help assess the impact of using them. The environmental agency DEFRA has announced that it will further tighten regulations on the use of overflows. And they say they will include a few measures. The frequency of use of overflow pipes should be restricted. The amount of untreated sewage that can be discharged into overflow pipes is to be reduced. The controls on the use of overflow pipes are to be tightened. It just doesn't go with Michael Gove's plans here. And on the other side, businesses in the EU are not allowed to discharge raw sewage into those waters. The EU Wastewater Treatment Directive requires that all wastewater discharged into bodies of water must be subjected to appropriate treatment. And this directive also applies to wastewater from companies operating in the EU. The Wastewater Treatment Directive stipulates that wastewater must be subjected to at least mechanical and biological treatment. Mechanical treatment is used to remove coarse impurities such as sand and stones from the wastewater. Biological treatment is designed to break down organic matter such as feces and food waste. In certain very critical cases, the Wastewater Treatment Directive may permit exceptions. However, these exceptions are very strictly regulated and are only granted in absolutely exceptional cases. For example, exceptions can be granted if there are the big floodings we have seen, so the floods we have seen in recent weeks, and they are close to catastrophe. So companies in the EU are therefore not allowed to discharge untreated wastewaters into the rivers. If they do so, they may be subject to fines or other sanctions. And the EU Wastewater Treatment Directive is an important step to reduce pollution of water bodies in the EU. And this directive helps ensure that wastewater discharged into water bodies undergoes appropriate treatment and protects the water quality of water bodies. It is important to note that the EU Wastewater Treatment Directive had to be implemented by each member state. And member states can therefore enact additional regulations that are stricter than the EU directive, but they must not go below it. And why am I talking about this? Because Great Britain was involved in the introduction of the directive. The directive was adopted by the Council of the European Communities on May 21st in 1991. Great Britain was then a member of the European Community. Great Britain took an active part in the development of the directive. The UK government made proposals for the directive and participated in the negotiations. The UK government has even welcomed the directive as an important step towards improving water quality in Europe. After Brexit, the UK is no longer bound by EU directives. Gove is right there. However, Great Britain has announced that it will continue to comply with the directive after Brexit. The UK government has recognized the EU directive as an important standard for water quality. Well, that has probably changed with the announcement of Michael Gove's new policy in his department. But to be honest, what we've seen in recent years with the overflow and everything, that never was really exactly following this directive. But as I said in another video this week already, environmental protection is not high on the list of this government anymore after they saw that they can win votes by doing less against climate change and environmental protection. I just say Uxbridge. And so I can really imagine that they will go ahead with this despite all the protests. And if you want to know more about UK politics or Brexit, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.